Chαίrete, friends. Welcome to Classics in Color, your weekly dive into some of the ancient world's wackiest facts. I'm Mark Graves. Today, and for a while now in the United States, there has been an ongoing, very heated debate around the topic of abortion. And I have absolutely no desire to try to tackle such a controversial topic on this channel. It would be completely irrelevant, first of all, and I am absolutely not qualified to have that discussion. But what I thought might be interesting would be to just take a look at the classical world, ancient Rome, ancient Greece. What did they think? What did they feel? What were their practices and traditions? And I'm hoping that as we take a look at this, we can put on our anthropologist hats, right? When a scientist shows up to study cannibals, hopefully if he's a good scientist, he won't immediately just start yelling in their face about how horrible they are and try to bring them to Jesus. He will hopefully first try to just get himself into their minds and their culture and understand what is going on before making any judgments. So that is what I try to do when looking at the ancient world, and hopefully that is what you will be able to do as well, and we can avoid getting into any nasty debates in the comments. I also need to do a really quick thank you to Christian Lace for his article, which is the main inspiration and source for this video. It's entitled Infants Between Biological and Social Birth in Antiquity. So without further ado, let's get started. So the focus of the article, as the title indicates, is trying to tease out the distinctions between the physical birth of an infant and the social birth and acceptance of an infant, which typically happens several days after the physical birth. And there's a lot here. It's very complicated, so I'm going to do my best to unpack it as Christian laid it out. But to give it to you very briefly at first, and then we'll dive into it further. Typically, 5 to 10 days after an infant is born, there's this whole ceremony that is held to sort of formally accept it into the family, and it's typically given a name at that point. And before that point, it is socially acceptable if you do not want this infant to, usually to abandon it. So it's more uncommon for you to actively kill the baby, but it was very common practice for families to expose unwanted children. So basically you would leave them out in the wilderness, or in some cases, if you lived in an urban environment, you might just, leave it out on a street corner or even in a garbage dump. And sometimes these babies were picked up by other people who wanted them, either to incorporate them into their families or to raise them as slaves. But sometimes these infants did die from exposure. Christian makes it very clear, and I would like to as well, that it's not like the physical birth just didn't count. It didn't mean anything. There were absolutely families who were overjoyed the second that their baby was born and, had a whole big celebration. And the giving of the name a few days later was more of a formality than anything else. And it is also true that in subsequent years, as people celebrated their birthdays, they celebrated them on the anniversary of their being born, not of their being given a name. So it's not like the physical birth is nothing, and it's not like the giving of a name is this black and white line that we can draw in the sand. I also have to make the clarification, as I always do, that when we're talking about the ancient world, this is a vast span of time, many, many, many different subcultures within the two cultures of Greece and Rome. So the answer to these questions can vary a lot depending on when and where we're looking at. To give you some examples, followers of Orphism, so cultists, believe that the embryo was already or should already be considered completely alive. So they didn't believe in abortion. They thought that was wrong. And of course, when Christians come on the scene later, they also have sort of a similar take. But there were also people in the ancient world like Plutarch who believed that a child at this period has more the nature of a tree than of a person. So it's not that it's not alive at all, but it's more like a plant than a person, and therefore we can treat it accordingly. It's not a huge sin or violation to kill an infant at that stage. But there certainly would have been infants that were killed or abandoned at this stage for many different reasons. Maybe the infant was a girl and the family thought they already had too many girls. Maybe the family was undergoing a period of intense stress, like famine or war. Maybe the infant had some sort of medical issue where the family did not want to have to raise that infant. The mother and the father would have been involved in having to make that decision, and they probably would have been advised by the midwife. She would have been able to advise them to say, oh, this infant has this issue, but it's very minor, they'll grow it. Or this infant, it looks like it's totally healthy, but I can tell that it's going to develop this or that problem moving forward. So midwives actually served a very important function in that regard. Next up, we are going to take a look at a quote from Plato, where he's giving a metaphor where he is comparing basically the abortion of an argument to the abortion of an infant, saying, now I've made this argument, let's examine it to see if we want to keep it or get rid of it. And so we get sort of an insight into what this inspection ceremony, which sometimes would have been kind of incorporated into that naming ceremony, what that might have looked like. Well, we have at last managed to bring this argument forth, whatever it turns out to be. And now that it is born, we must in very truth perform the rite of running around it within a circle, the circle of our argument, and see whether it may not turn out to be, after all, not worth rearing, but only a wind egg, an imposture. But perhaps you think that any offspring of you bear to see it examined and not get angry if it is taken away from you, though it is your firstborn. And indeed, if we look at a Greek city like Athens, we see that the standard ceremony seems to be something like what Plato is describing. So somewhere between 5 and 10 days, different sources give different numbers. You wash your hands, you pick the baby up, you carry it around in a circle, you give it its name, and all of your family and friends are there, kind of cheering and, celebrating the baby and formally accepting it into their family. The Roman situation was very similar, but there were a few differences and some details we can go into. For example, the number of days after birth until the naming ceremony varied depending on if it was a boy or a girl. So boys would have been named on the 9th day versus girls on the 8th. Also, for the Romans, the ceremony didn't just involve the parents, the maternal aunt and uncle were also supposed to be there and participate in this ceremony. And we actually have the name of the ceremony, so it would have been called the Nominalia or the Dies Lustricus, so basically the name day. Another interesting thing is if we look at the Roman legal code, we see that there were sometimes instances where it was required to count how many children someone has. You want to legally know the number, and it's indicated in the code that you are actually only supposed to count children who have survived until their nominalia in that number, which does bring up an interesting point which I have neglected to mention so far, which is that although sometimes children would have been deliberately killed or abandoned before their nominalia, they also just as frequently could have not survived. Mortality rate was incredibly high in the ancient world without modern medicine, and so a lot of children would have died just naturally in that intervening time. And it's possible that having that delay before you sort of formally announce the infant and tell all your friends and family about it might actually help the family a tiny bit with processing that grief and that loss. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Special thank you, as always, to subscribers and to Patreon members, and I hope to see all of you again next week. Χαίρετε.